When you meet someone new, what's one of the first things that you ask them? Why do you look like that? No, I'm kidding. You probably say, oh, what do you do? As in, what's your job? And think about it this way. If you were to meet a woman and ask her, oh, how do you do? And what do you do? And she said, nothing, I don't work. You probably wouldn't think too much of it. Cool, she's a stay at home mom, or she's a housewife, or whatever, hopefully by choice. But if a grown man with two balls between his legs were to tell you, look you in the eye and tell you that he doesn't do diddly for work, then you'd probably think of him as some kind of loser. And that's because men get their patriarchal dividends as long as they keep cashing in their labor and trading their time for capital. In other words, having a job and making money. Obviously, I am generalizing because this applies to mainly middle class and lower class men, which is the majority of men. But these dudes really only get the benefits of patriarchy when they're useful to the labor force. And that's partially because patriarchy, capitalism, and feminism inadvertently combined forces and ended up making men obsolete. Not on purpose, but as a byproduct of this thruple, capitalism, patriarchy, feminism, that no one asked for. And that is the other part of the puzzle and part 3 of this 5-part series that we are going to get into today. If you've just stumbled upon this episode as the first time listening to this podcast, I highly suggest listening to parts 1 and 2 before listening to this one. Although you can also listen to it as a standalone episode if you so choose. How do you do? Okay, so remember the magic formula I talked about in last episode about how the way society is set up is intended. I don't know why I said it like that. Was intended for women to submit to men to submit to capitalism, and capitalism to submit to patriarchy. Today, we're going to talk about a huge chunk of that formula. We're going to talk about how men submit to capitalism and how capitalism submits to patriarchy. And I'm wearing another blazer today and holding a pen. So again, you can't question what I say, because once again, I am an authority figure. So, in order to understand this formula, I feel like I need a whiteboard or something. But in order to understand this formula, we need to understand men's role in society. Okay, just really basic. What is their role? Remember how I talked about the origins of patriarchy and how people needed to act like their defined role so they could be of service to the state? And men's role was to go fight in wars. Well, one of their roles. Well, fast forward about 5,000 years, men's role now is to be the breadwinner, to be the provider, to be the protector. And all of these things, especially the provider part, is tied to masculinity as being defined by men's capitalist contribution and productivity. At one point, the role of men as the provider was a control tactic for that formula to work, for women to submit to men, because men held the purse strings. They had the financial power in the family, in the marriage, and so whoever held the financial, document, whoever held the checkbook, held the power. But what was once a role that was meant as a way for men to have power in society and control over women that role basically fucked itself, because with second wave feminism, which took place between the 1960s and 80s, we saw that women fought and were given, I shouldn't say given, I should say that the right to work was withheld, and women finally fought for that right back. So women got the right to work. They got the right to open bank accounts in their own names and open bank accounts without their husband's permission. And women begin to have financial autonomy. Women become free agents in the capitalist system, and they no longer depend on men for their financial livelihood, or their livelihood to begin with. So when men are removed from this formula and women no longer have to submit to men, that disrupts the whole foundation of this system. And it especially disrupts the fact that men are no longer able to exert that control and that financial warfare that they had over women. And so that role of men as the provider no longer carries the power that it intended. And men simply become cogs in the machine. And to be honest, they were always cogs in the machine. If you think back to the Industrial Revolution, because we lived during that time, right? But if you know a little something about the Industrial Revolution and about life and worker conditions in the 1800s, especially for the proletariats, right? Lower class, not really middle class. Middle class is more of a recent phenomenon, but for the working class, let's call it that, the working class, life was not good. For most of history, life sucked. For everyone. For the majority of history, life was full of suffering. And totally unrelated, but I think that's one of the reasons that religion came about and became such a popular thing, was that it told people, okay, well, your life sucks right now, but if you act good and you're a good girl, you're a good boy, then you're going to have an afterlife that will reward you for this suffering and that will give you an eternity of happiness. Kind of a side note. But anyway, for most of history, life was trash, okay? There's a very fundamental concept that everyone needs to understand, especially if you're a girly pop, which is that there is no such thing as something for nothing. There's no such thing as getting something for nothing, especially in the patriarchy. Oh my god, I'm so tired of saying the word patriarchy. I feel like I've said this word at least like 900,000 times in 2025. I'm tired. But anyway, there's no such thing as getting something for nothing. And that applies to women, that applies to men, that applies to turtles and spiders and sea urchins and anything. There's no such thing as getting something for nothing. Even for men. Okay? Like I was saying earlier, men had this role of the provider and the breadwinner and the family accountant. But that it wasn't that they got that for nothing. It wasn't that they just had this position of power and that's it. They had this position of power as long as they were of service to capitalism, as long as they were productive members of the workforce. Because when you are working class, and even today, if you are middle class, your life can change in the snap of a finger. Your life is precarious. Most people are one inconvenience, one emergency, one big unforeseen expense away from being in massive debt or defaulting on a payment or not being able to pay their mortgage or their rent. So people's positions, even men's positions in the capitalist system, is very precarious. Men's position as the breadwinner or as the provider is a precarious position to begin with, unless you are, part of the bourgeoisie. I feel like one of those assholes who went to Europe and now tries to pronounce everything correctly. Yep, I went to Ibiza. I went to Barcelona. But no, okay. No, I spent 12 years being educated in French. I'm going to use my French accent, okay? So the bourgeoisie, we're not talking about those motherfuckers, okay? Because that is a whole different realm of power and control and power dynamics. I'm talking about the average or the sub-average Joe, right? Working class or lower class and middle class people. Okay, now I lost my train of thought. Where was I? Okay, oh my god. I do this all the time. I think I was talking about so how your position or how men's position as the breadwinner is precarious. They might even be one workplace injury away from not being able to work and be productive. And I know a lot of women like to say, well, who set that system up? Listen, I know we are frustrated. The patriarchy and the world we live in is so is so trash. And so many of us are so frustrated and angry that we are living in this world because I'm not even kidding. I am positive. I'm willing to bet everything I have that aliens have found Earth and they're trying to stay as far away as possible from it because Earth is the ghetto of the universe. I feel like there's a planet out there where the aliens are watching us as their sitcom. And they're like, look what these buffoons are doing today. They got this guy with an orange skin tone running a country before they had the senile guy running the country. So, anyway, I'm gonna lose my train of thought again. So, listen, I know. Who set that system up? Let me tell you who didn't set that system up. Freaking Joe Prosciutto, who's working as an accountant making 65 grand a year. Actually, with a name like Joe Prosciutto, you're probably a tradesman. So, let me tell you who did not set that system up. Joe Prosciutto, who's making 65 grand, let's call it 75 grand, as an electrician. And I'm not a male apologist. You baddies know me by now. I am not a male apologist. I am just as ruthless as the next bitch. But I like to think critically about these things. And a lot of these single-celled organisms who want to talk crap about my stuff say that I'm a man-hater. I don't hate anyone. I don't hate anyone. All these years of education, I don't have 2 degrees for nothing, okay? Because I learned how to think critically about things. So who set that system up? Men in power. Men in power because they had an agenda. And who benefits from that system the most? Men in power because they have an agenda. That's not to say that Joe Prosciutto doesn't benefit from the patriarchy in many ways. Joe Prosciutto can still walk down the street at night and not be afraid of getting attacked or raped. Joe Prosciutto probably makes more than Jeanette Prosciutta, the female electrician he's working with, who's probably more skilled than he is. Joe Prosciutto still calls the shots in his household, and his wife, Angie, doesn't have as much power as he does. So yes, Joe Prosciutto benefits from the patriarchy in a lot of ways. But he's still also at the mercy of the patriarchy and at the mercy of capitalism. Because if Joe Prosciutto gets electrocuted at work one day and he's no longer able to work, then what's he going to do? Now he's a bum because Joe has to provide for his wife Angie and his 3 kids, Danny, Sophia, and Joe Jr., and also for his ma. His pop passed away a few years ago. He was an electrician before him and his grandfather before that. And his great-grandfather was alive when there was no electricity. So, guys, I'm making a whole story up for this made-up guy. But all that to say, most average men, the average Joe, Prosciutto is at the mercy of the system. He benefits from the system in many ways, but he's still at the mercy of the system. Because in order for capitalism to exist as we know it, the system needs workers. The system needs labor. The system functions by making labor productive. In other words, by making money off of other people's work. So workers are needed for capitalism to exist in the same way that men are needed for patriarchy to exist. Like I said in one of the previous episodes in this series, patriarchy is the organization of servitude. At least the way I understand it. It's the organization of servitude, and it relies on people to play their role. Joe Prosciutto and the working class and the middle class get their patriarchal dividends as long as they are of service and make their labor productive for the bourgeoisie, for the upper class, for their bosses, for the people who own the companies that they work for. Because capitalism teaches us, men and women, it teaches us that we are not valuable. We're not valuable members of society unless we use our labor to be productive, unless we are making money. And it's usually not making money for ourselves because most of us go to work and clock in for somebody else. So we are not of value to society unless our labor has a dollar amount attached to it. That's how we've been conditioned to think, not just about ourselves, but about others as well. That's why an unemployed man is seen as a loser. You see an unemployed guy and we all point and laugh at him like in the high school movies. That's why men call themselves high value, and one of the pillars of a high value man is making six figures. Because they don't have anything inherently valuable the way women do, so they have to prove themselves through their ability to generate capital and be productive. And that's why a lot of men take so much pride in their jobs, even if their jobs are super high pressure and demanding and busy. Like, they'll literally try to win the suffering Olympics and brag about how high pressure and stressful their job is and how fast paced it is and all that crap, because it's the only way they can cope with their reality. And that's why most men are in survival mode. And they're so insufferable to be around. They're not funny, they're not fun, they're bad vibes. It's because they're in survival mode because of the way that this system is set up. Not to say that they don't have accountability and they can't take it upon themselves to improve their situation, especially because the system was built by men for men. But a lot of men have also had very few encounters with accountability in their lives. And so they don't even understand that they can take things into their hands. And so they have to blame everybody but themselves. They look everywhere but inwards. That's why the most down bad, no, literally think of it. Think of the most down bad man you know. He's probably literally on the brink of homelessness. And then think about the most down bad woman you know. She's probably body is tea, making a decent income, lives on her own, has hobbies, has multiple skills, and has a good education. Yeah. And listen, this is the way the system has been set up. Men's identities are so deeply tied to their ability to produce capital. That's just the way that it is. That's what they've been taught, and that's what they basically perpetuate daily. And I'm not here pitying them or, crying over the fact that Joe Prosciutto was under a lot of pressure and his back hurts. I don't give a fuck about Joe Prosciutto, okay? As women, we need to look at this critically and think, how can I benefit from the way that this system has been set up? Because if Joe Prosciutto's back hurts, then Jeanette Prosciutto's entire body hurts. So that's why it's important for women to find partners who are not abject losers, whose money-making capabilities are on point. There's no reason to be with a broke man or a struggling man or a man who makes less money than you or a man who is down bad and down on his luck. Who cares about those people? Let them figure it out for themselves. As a woman living in the patriarchy and listening to this podcast, you know that you're trying to ensure the best life for yourself, the best outcome for yourself, despite this butt crack system that we live in. And so you're not going to go for somebody like Joe Prosciutto, who's only making 75 grand. You're going to go for somebody who can give you everything that you want and more. That's not you being selfish. That's you looking at the cards you've been dealt and the butt crack system that we live in, that the aliens are laughing at, and making sure that you can get the best outcome for yourself. And people are going to, there's all sorts of labels tied to a woman who knows what she wants and isn't going to settle for a loser. You know, like a gold digger. I'm not digging for coal or trash. I'm not a dumpster diver. So call me a gold digger, but you can't call me a dumpster diver. The way we've all been conditioned to think is to look at the world around us, look at everything around us through economic logic, which means we're seeing the world through the lens of capital. So when we're looking for a partner, obviously we want to find some guy whose bread is up, of course, we owe that to ourselves. And people are also looking at us and judging us based on how expensive or cheap we look. I went to a drag show a couple of weeks ago, and one of the drag queens was like just giving like the little welcome remarks, and she was saying how please make sure to tip your queens well. Looking this cheap is actually very expensive. That was unrelated to anything I'm saying. I just wanted to share that. But anyway, we see everything through this economic logic. We see it that way, and people are looking at us that way because everyone is conditioned to think this way. Now, I want to revisit something that I mentioned a little bit earlier, which is that for the first time in history, a lot of men are experiencing accountability for the first time. Crazy. So crazy. The capitalist and patriarchal system that's been set up for all men to benefit, at least to some extent, is now being eroded by things like mass unemployment and cost of living crises and unaffordable housing and things that basically make somebody's breadwinning capabilities seem insignificant. Because no matter how hard people work now, especially the current generation of people who are theoretically in a position to buy housing, like millennials and Gen Z, no matter how hard we work, we can't afford a lot of these things that the generation before us, our parents, were able to afford. Right? Most people's parents probably bought their house for $2,000 and 6 raspberries. And now that house is worth over $1 million. I'm not even kidding. In my city, in Toronto, like a house that was 200 grand 15 years ago is now like 1.5 million. So a lot of men are now seeing accountability for things because women are also waking up to the fact that they don't need to be controlled by men. They are free agents and they can literally live a life free of men if they wanted to. And instead of men fixing up and having introspection and critical thinking and thinking to themselves, okay, how can I be a better version of myself? A lot of them are turning outward and blaming women and blaming DEI policies and making up funny things like the male loneliness epidemic. Because you now have a whole generation of men, and I'm generalizing here, there's not all men are like this, but enough of them are for me to be able to generalize. You have this whole generation of men who are at a crossroads now because their role as the provider and as the man, it had two functions. One was to exert control over women, right? So women can submit to men. And the other was for them to be able to exert control in the patriarchal and capitalist system so that they can be compensated for their productivity. That first part of their role as the providers has eroded, because for the first time in at least 5,000 years, women are no longer dependent on men. And, the single-celled organisms who are always in my comments like to say, oh, well, who's going to change the oil in your car? I'm going to pay someone to do that. Joe Prosciutto's cousin is going to change the oil in my car, sir. And the thing is, when we talk about the role of men as being obsolete, the only way a lot of these men clap back is by asking us who's going to perform tasks for us that we can pay for. Who's going to perform productive labor for us? Because there's really nothing that a man can do for you that you can't go out and pay for, have somebody pay for to do that task for you. So men have been cut out as the middleman between women and capitalism. So that formula where women submit to men submit to capitalism, capitalism submits to patriarchy, breaks down. So this is going to take a turn that you weren't expecting. Because while men have to make money to prove their worth, women have to. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned for the next episode. And let me tell you, that episode is going to take so many turns. Like, your mind is going to be blown at the end of it. So I can't wait. Anyway, don't forget that you are the baddest bitch in any building that you step foot in. Until next time, stay bad. Love you. Bye. And shout out to all the baddies on Patreon. Shout out to Adriana, Mina, Gemma, Priya, Katya, Irene, Naomi, Nilufa, Adelaide, Nadia, Faith, Amy, Simran, Melinda, Sophia M, Sophia K, Jada, Yael, Amara, Kat, and Jin. Thank you all so much for your support. Oh, how do you do? Oh, I'm well, thank you. What do you do? Oh, I just look pretty all day.